Let me open public hearing on 2018-26, an ordinance amending Chapter 21.28 Fairbanks North Borough Code to add definitions and standards for retrofit control devices, including ESPs. I still have first up Ms. Olson and second up Ms. Mullis. So, Ms. Olson, please give us your name, spell your last name, and give us your neighborhood.
Thank you. Jeannie Olson, 1890 Hollowell Road, North Pole, Alaska. I needed to testify here tonight instead of working outside on this beautiful fall morning or evening because of the persistent misinformation and kind of fake news that I continue to hear about ESPs. And I will provide another detailed program tomorrow afternoon to the stakeholders, so you're welcome to go to the Wood Centers for that. I'm pretty sure I have more hands-on experience with these residential ESPs than anyone else in this room, probably the borough and perhaps the state. So I shall begin. The EcoTube has no plates to clean, no small holes that might clog up, or chemical canisters that have to be recharged, and I hear that a lot. In fact, I just think back to your third grade physical science class. This is how ESPs work. I'm the ESP. This is PM 2.5. It's as simple as electrostatic fields that we did in third grade. A lot of people all over the country are paying attention to your decision here tonight. John Ackerley of the Alliance for Green Heat posted it on his Facebook page. I received an email this morning from the U.S. office of the testo instrument that they provided us when we did our Citizens for Clean Air study. And he said, it appears this issue is heating up in Fairbanks, and he gave us the link to the Newsminer article. So that's all over the nation. And at the National Mall this fall in November, where the Green Alliance people invite all these people with cutting-edge, clean stove burning things, 3 of the 12 stoves will have the ESPs in them. That's how significant it is, and it's taking off. And we're being left at the gate. I appreciate this issue has moved at kind of warp speed in government's perspective. Less than a year since the original ordinance was introduced by Mr. Roberts, and I heard about it. But we've lost another season now. So finally, I urge you to pass this ordinance. And there's a few changes I'd like to recommend, but probably won't have time to mention them. If we truly have local control, then let's have local control and create some things that no one else has done, because we need it, and we have not many other solutions. We don't need to just be the enforcers of the EPA and DEC rules. We can create our own. The community has been very supportive of this. Both Citizens for Clean Air and the wood burners have joined in support of this. In the words of a Harvard professor, the entire air quality situation is like an adaptive challenge. I urge you to help this by recognizing this technology is here to help all the stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. Let us see if there are quick questions for you. Mr. Quist has a question, and then Mr. Lawrence.
Is there a particular amendment that you would recommend to this ordinance?
I don't know how drastic you can have an amendment, but you certainly should require that all no-ash burners have ESPs installed with a sunset date, recognizing you can't get them installed this winter.
Any other? Mr. Lawrence, and then Mr. Gray.
That was my question.
Okay, Mr. Gray.
Same here.
Same question. Okay.
Easy.
Any other questions for Ms. Olson? I had one for you. You mentioned a stakeholder presentation. I wondered what time that was.
I believe it's at 3 o'clock at the Wood Center
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, you're going to leave us our friend?
Hope it sticks.
Okay, thank you. So in the empty seat, I have Miss Lee. Is Miss Lee in the room? Yep, here she comes. Ms. Mullis, welcome back. Please give us your name, spell your last name, tell us your neighborhood. You'll have 3 minutes.
Carrie Mullis, M-U-L-L-I-S, near the muskox. And I want to echo Jeannie's statements. And then I wanted to add one question. Is there any way at all that EPA can fund these ESPs for Fairbanks North Starborough?
So you'll know that we don't answer questions, but it's out there now.
Oh, well, okay. Well, that's, I mean, I would think that that would be somewhat a reasonable thing to bring up, is that, maybe they could help in on this.
Does that conclude your?
I think so.
Okay.
That was short and sweet.
Short and sweet, and we'll ask, I don't know, it is a technical question. Does the mayor or your staff know if the EPA funds ESPs? Alphabet soup. If
I'm
not,
sorry, can you repeat the question?
right. We were wondering if EPA funds ESPs. Presumably not at this time, since they don't approve them.
Well, we actually do have EPA here if it would be allowable for them to answer that question personally.
I'll look at the attorney.
You could take public testimony from him.
Okay, thank you. Or during our, it could be in the staff during our discussion, perhaps. So, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Ms. Mullis? Seeing none, thank you. And I have an empty seat if anyone wishes to testify on Ordinance 2018-26. Ms. Lee, welcome. Please give us your name, spell your last name.
Patrice Lee, L-E-E, Chino Hot Springs Road. I'm here today to talk about the enormous task of reducing our air pollution and the fact that I don't believe that any one plan is going to do the whole shoot and caboodle. It's going to take taking bites out many different ways. And one, of course, is getting affordable natural gas here and as quickly as possible. But the other, I see great merit in the ESPs. Having done research with Dr. Olson and having been in contact with the Swiss government and technicians and the people who manage and run the testing instruments that are required to test those, I can tell you that it's quite promising and that we should be looking at every possible option for cleaning up the air. It's called picking up the pennies. You don't leave the pennies on the ground, because when you pick up enough of them, it adds up to $1, and that's significant. So I want to see that no-ash homes be considered for retrofit of ESPs as soon as possible, because they are going to be burning through the stage 1 and 2 alerts under most conditions, as long as they have a certified stove, as I understand. So if they have that ESP installed properly and available and working, then that is a reduction to our pollution, and we need to do that. And then I want to see an organized research done so that they can be approved in coordination with the EPA, ADEC, and the borough to, if I believe they're going to pan out to be as good as they say, or at least good enough to take out a big bite of the pollution. And I'd like to see that research go on with CCHRC or some other group that can, outside of the borough, that can handle the research and get things approved and going as quickly as possible. You have to order on time. You can't wait till this time of the year to make decisions. We're already behind the curve for this year. It still could happen under certain extraordinary circumstances for a few of the no-ash homes, but we need to be ordering early in the spring for installation during the summer so that it can be done safely and less expensively. With that said, there are other energy alternatives around the corner. I look forward to working with the combination of any renewables and ESPs and anything that's going to meet the goals of the Interior Energy Project, which is affordable energy and cleaner air, both of which we desperately need. So thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Let us see if there are questions for you. See any? Thank you. I have another empty seat if someone wishes to come forward. Welcome. Please give us your name, spell your last name, and tell us your neighborhood.
My name is Dan Brown, spelled like the color, B-R-O-W-N. My neighborhood is Maplewood, which is in Portland, Oregon.
Thank you.
I work for the Environmental Protection Agency, and I am up because I wanted to say that we're happy to work with the borough in looking at some of the testing protocols that would be needed to demonstrate the effectiveness of an ESP. EPA does not have a lot of information about the effectiveness of these of this technology. However, in other areas of control technology, for example, diesel particulate filters, which can be retrofitted onto diesel vehicles, EPA has a verification process for those. It's a fairly robust process. Generally, the manufacturers of that equipment have a vested interest in getting that equipment verified, because once that technology is verified, then it is actually eligible for funding by EPA under one of our grant programs. Somebody asked a question about whether or not this particular technology could be funded by EPA. As of now, I would say no, but if there was ever a program analogous to what we do with diesel emission reduction technology, there is a verification process for that, and once that technology is verified, then it does become eligible for grant money from EPA.
Thank you. Let's see if there are questions for Mr. Brown. I presume that concluded your statement.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Mr. Lawrence?
Mr. Brown, the performance standard embedded in this particular ordinance tonight would require a control device to achieve the same emissions rate as an oil-fired boiler. And, well, let me just make a statement here. From my perspective, if there was no wood-burning stoves in this community and everybody used oil-fired boilers or furnaces or something cleaner than that, I don't believe would have an air quality problem. So my question is it EPA's position that performance standard has to be achieved in order to support ESPs, or could a lesser standard, from my perspective, a lesser standard would still make a big difference in the quality, in the air quality of this community? You understand what I'm saying? I guess what I'm saying is, why such a high standard? And is that EPA's input, or is that just coming from the administration?
Yeah, so that's EPA's perspective is that we would love to see the borough and the state come up with the local solutions that are going to show attainment of this area. So we're in the position to support the efforts at the local level and the state level, and then once the decisions have been made at the local and state level, then we'll be reviewing that to assure that there's a pathway to clean air. And so I don't know if that exactly answers your question.
And I'll remind you that you're asking questions, not making statements and arguing positions.
Well, does EPA have a position as to what the performance standard for these devices, control devices, what they should be? I mean, what the standard performance level should be?
EPA has not looked at the performance of these devices. So
No, I'm not asking that. I'm asking, does EPA have a position regarding what the performance standard should be for these devices? Yeah.
I would say no, because EPA establishes emission standards for technologies that we're establishing regulations for, and this technology is not subject to any EPA regulations. It's coming from a foreign country. We don't know. We just don't know anything about it, quite frankly.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Brown? Mr. Mayor?
Along the lines of what Mr. Lawrence was just saying, so our staff has made a somewhat informed assumption, I guess the best way to put it, that since this is an exemption during a curtailment period, or is authorizing an exemption, and during a curtailment period, you would have to shut off your wood stove and go to a your oil boiler, essentially, or something even cleaner than that. And so our assumption is that we would be backsliding if we were giving an exemption to something that was dirtier than the oil boiler. And is that a correct assumption? Do you think we would be backsliding if we did that?
I don't know, Mayor Castle, because I wasn't. I was involved in this on the sort of the end of the sort of testing of the technology. I don't know. I understand that. I understand what you're saying is correct. We, of course, would definitely be concerned with any backsliding provisions, in comparison of the curtailment program that's currently approved into the SIP. So we would have to do an assessment of anything that's submitted to us, and to ensure that backsliding is not occurring. But we generally would do that once something is formally submitted to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Brown? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming down and for coming up and then down. So I have an empty seat. If someone wishes to speak on ordinance 2018-26, and Mr. Fox, welcome.
Thank you. Jimmy Fox, Gina Ridge, FOX, last name spelling.
Thank you.
Not a long testimony here to give, just appreciation, first of all, to Mr. Roberts and Mr. Cooper and Mr. Lawrence, especially staff, Mr. Zarnecki, Dr. Olson, and Ms. Lee, and others, Dan Givens. Folks have put a lot of time and effort in that, which is, I think, one reason that we should support this ordinance. I support it. I just have a couple technical questions that I want to just surface for the Assembly. One is line 162 and 163. There's a reference to pellet fuel appliance. In looking at the definitions in code, I'm not exactly sure if that includes or does not include a pellet hydronic heater. And the reason I bring that to your attention is that if we're testing in three broad categories, and if we tested the device, if my assumption is correct, if we test the device on a pellet hydronic heater and it doesn't pass the test, that might mean that a regular small pellet appliance wouldn't be authorized for a retro-controlled device. So I could be wrong. I may misinterpret code in this ordinance, but I wanted to throw that out there. And then the second point is on line 167, and that 0.0028 pounds per million BTU number, if that is heating oil emission rate, some kind of a standard, I don't know if that's ultra-low sulfur diesel emissions or regular. And as we hear discussions about whether or not we'll be shifting to ultra-low sulfur, would we be backsliding by, anyway. So just wanted to flag those two things. Probably you folks have already talked about that, but I don't know that, so just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Let's see if there are questions for you. Yes, Mr. Cooper has a question for you.
Or if we get technical answers to the technical questions. I don't
The
know
question
if,
about both the pellet fuel appliance, do you want to wait? Do you want that now or do you want that?
we can now or later, but perhaps staff can think about those. We can get an answer to them during debate.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Fox? Seeing none, thank you. We appreciate you coming down. I have another empty seat. Ms. Mannon, welcome. Please give us your name, spell your last name, tell us your neighborhood.
Wendy Mannon, M-A-N-N-A-N, and I live in North Pole. A little bit scattered because I'm not quite sure what I want to say. I'm definitely for this ordinance. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, trying to get other technologies or other options available for people to burn wood and help clean up the air at the same time. I just want to say with the no ashes, I think that's a good thing to get these ESPs on no ashes as soon as possible. I still want to reiterate that if you really want to get people involved with the no ashes, that you need to get that financial aspect taken out of there. I'm really surprised that it's been said before that it's taken this long to get to this point, to look at other ways to solve this problem other than curtailment. Just sort of thinking about all the rules and regulations and how it's always come back to, well, this has worked in other communities, so this is what we're going to do here. Curtailment worked in these communities, and so it has to work here. And I don't feel, finally, I think that the EPA might be sort of listening, that our environment and our weather and our unique situation needs a unique problem solver. And we could have gotten so much farther if EPA had been on board for these, we are unique, sooner. And we still didn't get the question really answered as to whether or not this would be considered backsliding. I don't think that was a solid answer there. But in order to really get everybody involved, I think we need more options. Right now, there aren't options, and we have to get more options on the table, or people are still going to look at these rules and this panel and say, sorry, not going to do it. I have two choices, and if those are my only two choices, I'm still not going to follow your rules. So I think we need to be as proactive as possible, getting as many solutions as humanly possible that do not include curtailment only on the table.
Thank you, Ms. Mannon. Let's see if that Mr. Gray has a question for you.
Oh, first, Mr. Zarnicki, didn't you say that the ordinance as written, the determination is that it wouldn't be backsliding? As currently written?
Correct. As currently written, there's been a lot of folks with DEC and within EPA that have reviewed the ordinance, and currently as written, it would not constitute backsliding. That's been the concurrence. But I think, as Mr. Brown with EPA mentioned, the formal determination for backsliding, that nobody's actually gone through and make the formal determination. That's just the initial look. It's like with everything in air quality, you never get a definitive answer, but we live in gray areas.
No pun intended, Mr. Gray. Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess, well, just out of curiosity, you mentioned the financial aspect of the no ashes, which I totally get, and I understand your concerns with that. You kind of hinted at some of the other pieces tied to that, when applying for these things as being kind of invasive, such as, proving that you can burn wood adequately or properly and store it. Are you okay? Those items are in here as part of the application for getting a device such as an ESP. So
yes.
Are you okay with them in the context of this?
Yes, I think everything with getting people to register their stoves, a little bit there, but to get people to understand that they have to have the right device and the right wood and everything, those are important, and the borough needs that data. I think for the no ash waivers, for both of them, everything is good except you have to be poor before we give you the no ash, or the other part of that no ash is that you have no other system, and that's fine too, because some people only have wood burning as their system. But it's a very big sticking point for me, and I really believe for many members of the community that they're not going to step forward and apply for a no ash because it has that financial aspect attached to it.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming down. We appreciate it. So I have another empty seat if someone wishes to speak on Ordinance 2018-26. Welcome. Please give us your name, spell your last name, and give us your neighborhood.
Hello, my name is Denise Koch, last name Koch. I live in Juneau, Alaska, and I'm the Director of the Division of Air Quality at the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. I wanted to commend the local community for their work on this issue. This is truly local work, local citizens, the assembly on the agency side. It's been the borough of when I talk about the agencies, I mean of the borough, DEC, and EPA. It's been the borough who's done most of the heavy lifting. EPA has done a lot in terms of they have a lot of expertise at headquarters to look at and to weigh in on the different methodologies, the different testing methodologies. One of the things that DEC did when we looked at the ordinance language as it was proposed, we looked at it through the lens of the backsliding issue, which is why I came up here, because that issue has been raised. And as Mr. Zarnecki said, we are comfortable with the ordinance as written, that it's not going to present a backsliding issue. As he had mentioned, once again, that we don't know that 100% for sure until we submitted it to EPA and you get an approval. So all I could tell you is that we've looked at it and we have a high level of comfort. The biggest component of this rule that you would not, that I think is really critical on the anti-backsliding portion of the question is the fact that this rule does not allow burning over 55 when you hit that 55 micrograms per cubic meter. That I think provides a lot of that's probably the strongest aspect of why this would not be a backsliding issue. So we feel comfortable with the way that the rule is as written.
Thank you. Questions for Ms. Koch? Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Koch, you identified the 55 as a threshold that's important on backsliding. How important is the .0028 emission standard? Being our best estimate, that's an oil boiler, and I understand that that's complicated too. But how much could somebody fiddle with that before we would fiddle with that number, that threshold, before we'd start being concerned about backsliding?
I would be concerned about backsliding if you started fiddling with that number at all. Anti-backsliding gets really complicated, so it's hard to give, if the numbers start changing, it's hard to give a definitive answer on the fly, because frankly I would go back and I would talk to our lawyers and they would look at it from their lens as well. But that particular limit that you just mentioned with the equivalency to an oil furnace and the fact that you don't have burning over 55 micrograms per cubic meter, those are some of the sort of the core of why we feel comfortable with the ordinance the way that it's written.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Ms. Koch? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
Ms. Koch, there's an initiative that will be on the ballot coming, next month, which would, if passed, would prohibit this borough from regulating wood burning in any way. If that initiative passes, what impact would that have on DEC's actions in dealing with this community's air quality problem?
I'm hesitating here because as a state entity, we're not really supposed to comment on or try to be seen as influencing local elections. So I don't think I could really answer those questions.
Yeah, we're getting lots of whispers about maybe being careful here. So,
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Cooper.
Thanks for being here and testifying on this ordinance. I guess I have two questions. First, can you tell me a little bit more about the backsliding process? Say we fiddled with the .0028 and relaxed that standard, and DEC does its analysis. What happens after DEC does its analysis and says, yep, that's backsliding?
So we would have to do an analysis and we would come up with our own conclusion, and then there would be a process where we would have to submit something to EPA, and ultimately EPA would also have, they would be able to make a determination as to whether or not it's backsliding. So we have two sort of pieces there. We'd make our determination and we'd submit it to EPA, and they would ultimately make the decision there.
Then say we went through that process, both DEC and EPA made a determination that it was backsliding. Then do you come back to the borough and say, hey, can you fix this?
I'm not sure if you're backsliding. The challenge is that you have a federally approved moderate SIP. And if you are backsliding from a federally approved plan, there is the potential, and there's lots of process involved here, but there's the potential for EPA to say, you are not implementing your federally approved plan, and they generally give you time to make corrections, but ultimately if you don't make corrections, they could it could be considered a planning failure, and they could start sanction clocks. I mean, that's not, I think, where anyone ever wants to go, but there's a process associated with that. But that's why anti-backsliding it's so important not to backslide from a federally approved plan.
And then I guess one different topic but related, ESPs on no-ash devices. Is that something that you've discussed as part of this process, and is it something that DEC is amenable to?
I think it's a great idea. I think it makes a lot of sense. We know that there is always going to be some level of no ash in the community. There's always going to be some level of wood burning. And although we haven't had the sort of testing yet as envisioned, the independent laboratory testing that's envisioned in this ordinance, it seems like it will help, even if it doesn't meet necessarily those standards for everyone. If you have a no ash population that's going to be burning anyway, it seems like there's very low risk of putting on a technology that has some level of emission reduction. So, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for joining us this evening, for coming up. I have now 2 empty seats. Is there anyone else that wishes to come forward and speak? It looks like we have a couple of people that want to have a 1-minute bite at the apple. No one else is coming forward. So for the, yep. So Ms. Olson, you looked like you were the first one to stand for 1 second, so.
Jeannie Olson, 1890 Hollowell, North Pole, Alaska. I just wanted to not put the blame on anybody, especially the EPA, about not grabbing the bull by the horns on this new technology that's not new in a lot of the world, but just that we can just move on. Because I'd like to point out that 4 years ago, Air Quality was contacted by the EcoTube representative, Nico Lohr, and also the Alaska Synergy for Energy Power. And he's got the phone log and the emails about, they just weren't interested in it. So I really have to give Lance Roberts the credit for all of this. He was the one that brought this ordinance forward last fall, and we're moving on, and I hope that that's what you guys do too. And don't get hung up on the backsliding. Let's just do it. We have wasted so much time, and if we can just reduce the emissions by 50%, that's huge. And I realize that, there's just 2 stacks that were done last year, and we were averaging 60%, but imagine if we just reduced it a little bit. That's great.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. Let's see if there are questions. Seeing none, appreciate it. Ms. Mannon.
Wendy Mannon, M-A-N-N-A-N. I live in North Pole. I have a couple questions that may or not be able to be answered. I'm just throwing it out there. And it might have already been answered already, but if ESPs are tested to be, and we send them out, and they are tested to be as clean as an oil-fired furnace, why would they need to be shut off at the 55 micrograms per whatever? Would that still be required? And if they are burning as clean as oil-fired furnaces, then why would them staying on be considered backsliding? So there's 2 separate questions. The third question is, are we the only community that has curtailments involved in their air quality? Are we the only community that have either no ash waivers or no ash waivers that have financials attached to it? And I don't know if you guys can answer that question or those.
Probably not, but you've got them out into the universe and they might come up.
Okay.
Let's see if there are questions for you, though. I don't think any of those were technical questions. They seem kind of like policy, but they're interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I don't see anybody else coming forward, so I am going to, Mr. Bartos. So process-wise, we have moved past others coming forward. So if there's anyone else that wishes to speak, now would be the time. Mr. Bartos.
I appreciate the time. Hank Bartos, North Pole, in the worst.
And how do you spell your last name?
B-A-R-T-O-S.
Thank you.
I live in the worst air quality area of the borough, right next to a sensor that says we're the worst air quality in the borough. And I'm a senior citizen, so I'm in the most vulnerable group. Now, we in this community are like a dog team. We live in the harshest, coldest environment in the nation. We have the deepest inversions of any place in the nation. So when we're going someplace, and as a dog team, the lead dog, which is the leaders, have to break trail. And when you're breaking trail, you have to try new and better ways of doing it. And if that leader's not breaking enough trail, then you put another one in there. And then if you're at the back of the pack, of course, the scenery never changes. So we're like a dog team moving forward. We're all working together, trying to get us to win a race. So far, our air quality race, we've been going pretty slow, and we don't have any real wins to show. By breaking new trail with the ESPs, we have a chance of winning. We can make it happen. You know, right now, everyone thinks we have local control. But the DEC and the EPA and the Region 10 people tell us, well, not so fast. You know, step on the brake here. You don't quite have local control unless we approve it. Now, we've got an air quality division. DEC's got an air quality division, and they say their air quality division will evaluate and see how well the ESPs and the no ash information is working. Well, you know, our air quality division can do that too and put their input in if, in fact, we have local control. So I would urge you to look at this. I want you to approve this ordinance. I think it is the way to go. It's a great start. It gets us further down the trail and will pay dividends in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bartos. Let's see if there are questions. Seeing none, we appreciate you coming forward. And with that, I am going to close public hearing.
Move to adopt.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Cooper, do you want to, Mr. Roberts?
Oh, Mr. Roberts can go first.
Oh, your hand's up too? Okay. Oop, other hand? Oh. We're going to note that Mr. Lejewski has to depart chambers. So I've got Roberts, Cooper, and Quest at this time. Mr. Roberts.
So I guess I'm just going to start right off with an amendment. Line 167, change 0.0028 to 0.028.
Is there a second?
I'll second for the sake of discussion.
Okay, Mr. Roberts, would you like to speak to that? Oh, let me repeat it. So Mr. Roberts has moved and Mr. Cooper has seconded, amending on line 167 0.0028 to 0.028 MMBTU.
Yes, so
Roberts.
So let's see if I can explain this, especially for the general public who hasn't been involved with this. So we're testing these RCD devices, ESP and other devices, to remove enough, and the Air Quality Division, who helped us get the language crafted for this ordinance, came up with this number that basically says that these wood stoves with this device, whatever that device is, has to burn as clean as oil. Well, and even they admit that's going to be really, really hard to get that clean. But in the essence, we don't need to get that clean. We just need to get pretty clean. And we can get really close to that. But here's why it's not backsliding. That's because that's the big issue, right? Is it backsliding or not? So the backsliding is based on the 2015 ordinance, which doesn't talk about this type of level. It talks about the 55 micrograms or whatever. So that level of 55 is the biggest concern, and what was brought up by Ms. Koch there as the most important thing when you're dealing with backsliding. What this rating does is it gets us really close for the small amount of devices. Remember, this is only under 55. After that, they're not going to be allowed to burn anyway. So it's only when you've got your particulates under 55, and actually they could be stage 1 or 2 already at that point, so they or stage 1. So it's only in a small window there that they get to burn for a small amount of devices. So you're creating, if there's any extra pollution over what an oil furnace would do, and I'm would say that that's a maintained oil furnace. But if you're creating any extra pollution over that, that's a very small amount. What DEC has to do is they've got to make their SIP come out so that they show attainment. So they've come up with numbers, they've got their draft out, they've got it all figured out based on where our ordinances are. And so this small change, what they have to do is they just have to come up with a compensatory factor to show EPA that they can still arrive at these numbers. And what I say is that DEC is up to the task. They can make those. We're not going to be backsiding with EPA because we're not violating that 2015 ordinance that we set up. But DEC will have to do some extra work to change the SIP so that their total emission inventory ends up being less. And what I want to do is make sure that we have a better chance of getting some of these devices approved, because that's really good. You get it down to that .028, you know, you're down to where you're better than pellet stoves. You've got this really good emissions output going on, and I think that that is still a huge positive step that helps eliminate a lot of pollution. And I want to remind you, in all the other times, the other 99% of the winter, when you're not above 55 micrograms, those ESPs will be working, decreasing pollutants that entire time. You know, we're focusing on the window of time that they're actually going to be under the effect of our ordinance and saving for the emissions inventory there. But all the rest of the time, they're not putting out these pollutants. So that helps lower the average over the entire winter. That helps lower the total amount of pollutants going out in the air. So I think a very positive step would be to help make this more realistic for getting some approved devices that can help solve our problem. That DEC is up to the task to compensate the emissions contributions of different BACMs and implement that in the SIP that they give to EPA, and that EPA will see that we're not violating the moderate SIP that they've already approved. So I'd ask you to support changing this number. Thanks.
Okay, on the amendment, I have next Mr. Quist. Is there any?
Thank you. Yeah, if I understand correctly, this amendment, if adopted, would allow for devices to produce 10 times the emissions as they would otherwise. And I mean, my question is twofold, and for air quality division, please. One, is my understanding correct? And secondly, can you speak to the amendment, please? Thank you.
Yes, your assumption is correct. By making that amendment, it would be roughly 10 times what the current threshold is. And yeah, with the amendment, as I stated earlier, we have worked collaboratively with the EPA and with the State of Alaska DEC on this ordinance, and I think as Ms. Koch stated, the two most important kind of pieces of this ordinance are the emission threshold and the 55 microgram per meter cubed ceiling where all devices would be shut off. And by changing any of those two items, you know, you're of course free to change whatever you want to, but all the collaborative work and the you know, idea that this would not constitute backsliding, that would not hold anymore. And so, you know, to speak also to I guess the larger air quality issue, we need around 80% emission reductions to reach attainment in the North Pole area. And those emission reductions are not easy to come by. That's on top of all of the current regulations that we have. Anything that takes us backwards, even by the smallest little bit, is going to have to be made up with another control measure. Those control measures look like date-certain removal of uncertified devices. They look like, you know, inspection warrants to increase the effectiveness of the curtailment program. They are not easy solutions. They're very contentious solutions. They're things like, removing all residential coal-fired heaters. And so anything that goes the smallest bit backwards is going to have to be made up by another difficult regulation. And so we came to that threshold, that 0.0028 threshold, and the 55 micrograms per meter cubed, twofold. One was to avoid the backsliding determination, but the other was that this is an exemption to an existing control measure, and we know that we don't want to move backwards in any way, shape, or form, because it's just going to be more painful when we have to look at the control measures to make up for that loss.
Thank you. And if I could follow up, for those reasons, I would speak against the amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper and then Mr. Roberts.
Thanks. So I guess maybe a question and a statement, or two questions. We'll see how this goes. Is there an equivalent that you can think of of a device that would emit at the proposed amendment level of 0.028? Is that equivalent to anything is that better, worse than a wood stove? I'm just trying to get a sense of where moving the decimal here would put the standard relative to devices.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't give you incredibly accurate numbers. I can just kind of characterize that in general. The cleanest solid fuel burning appliances emit an order of 2 magnitudes higher than an oil boiler. So if an oil boiler is 0.0028, then a typical clean wood stove would be 0.28, and so that I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. It helps get the context
of it.
And I guess so. The second part is probably more of a statement, which is I seconded this amendment for this discussion because I think it's worthwhile to talk about this number and where this number should be. I think when we were drafting this, we settled on 0.0028 as equivalent to an oil-fired boiler. But I think there's an interesting question. I don't know that 10 times this level is the right answer, but even something 0.005 or 0.008 might be, more in line. That's why I was asking questions earlier about the backsliding process, because to me, it may make sense to move this number a little bit if there's an opportunity after some analysis say, this isn't going to work, that we can go back and change it. Because my understanding is once we say, okay, we're at 0.028 and it's locked into a SIP, that we can't make that number bigger down the road. Is my understanding correct?
Somewhat. There's, as far as how this gets incorporated into a SIP and what happens with it, the state DEC has generally came in behind and backstopped our regulations and then incorporated them into the SIP. If the state believes that a rule is not maybe backsliding or is not going in the correct direction, the state doesn't have to adopt that rule, and it doesn't have to get incorporated into the SIP. And because this is an exemption to the curtailment program, it's not guaranteed that this particular exemption would be adopted by the state and incorporated into the SIP. And so there wouldn't, in that case, obviously the local control then is free to, change that threshold in the future when they get more information and, more analysis can be done. And even if it were to, end up going through the state regulation and going into the SIP, it takes quite a bit of time for those processes to happen. And so you're looking at, a couple, like a year down the road. And so there could be time to change it if that were the case.
Thanks. I think that the reason I asked this is, we know that 0.0028 is a standard because we at least we reasonably believe that's what the emissions are from an oil-fired boiler. But Mr. Roberts' suggestion of 0.028 or my suggestion of 0.005, or 0.008 are to a certain extent guesses. We don't know, and so it's hard to pick a number. But I want to be sensitive to the fact that it is a gas, and we're trying to find something that's going to work and reduce emissions. And Ms. Dodge, I know we can't do backsliding analysis on the fly, and I don't know if anyone from DEC or EPA wants to help answer questions, or if you want to allow them in the staff box.
I would be willing to allow somebody in the staff box on the ordinance, if I don't get the evil eye from my attorney. We're getting evil eyes. We'll talk later.
Yeah, it's not really a joint
It wasn't
proposal
noticed
where
as a
they're
joint meeting?
considered
Okay.
staff.
Thank you. Is that it? Mr. Roberts?
So I want to agree with Mr. Cooper's point that we can always shrink the number, but going bigger is what causes the backsliding that we're concerned about. So we want to be careful what number we put in the first time. But I want to point out the paper you guys were handed tonight. This was all about device efficiencies and how they affect the emission threshold. If you look at that, it gives these emission outputs in pounds per MMBTUs. And at the bottom of the blue list, you see there, hydronic heater phase 2 is 0.142. Well, that means the 0.028 is 20% of that, exactly. So we're getting an 80% reduction. Now, we're not dealing with hydronic heaters in this ordinance or in this and the next one. We're not going to that level with the categories. But if you look above that at all the other burners, everything else that's a wood stove, the fireplaces and the wood stoves, catalytic and non-catalytic, are all greater than that. The smallest one, the EPA certified catalytic wood stove, is 0.145. So again, that's 20%. That gives us the 80% reduction that we need, that air quality just said we need. So I believe that 0.028 is a very good number here to get us that 80%. Now, it's not quite as good for the pellet stoves, so I want to make sure that's out there for the public who doesn't have this paper. That's probably looks like 50% on an exempt pellet stove and a little bit less on EPA certified. So those are the kind of numbers we're looking at. We have some numbers, and we can see that that 0.028 is still an incredible difference from the devices out there that don't have these on them. So I think that we should start with a higher number and see where it goes and see where the testing leads us. And then that future assembly who gets the test results can modify this accordingly. But they might have a hard time if it's already in the SIP at a very low number trying to go higher. Thank you.
Any other questions or discussion, debate? Mr. Lawrence and Ms. Major.
I move to amend the amendment to the number of .01.
So it's been moved by Mr. Lawrence to change this to .01. Is there a second?
Second for the.
And seconded by Mr. Cooper. So Mr. Lawrence has moved to change on line 167 the currently considered .028 to .01, seconded by Mr. Cooper. Mr. Lawrence, wish to speak on it?
Well, I think Mr. Roberts has made some decent points about relaxing the performance standard some, but I know what the administration's concern is, and I suspect DEC and EPA. I'm concerned that this could be viewed as backsliding, but I think it's a number that will provide significant improvement to the air quality, but it's less of a standard. I mean, it's less strict and gives us a better chance of getting these devices approved.
On the amendment to the amendment, and Ms. Major.
So I guess I'll just say I'm in general concerned about doing this kind of math on the fly from the dais without really kind of fully understanding the second and third order of effects that could come with this. So I guess I would just go back to the staff and I would ask if we change this number. So maybe I'm not sure if I understood some of the earlier testimony, but if we change this number from the .0028 to any other number, there could be negative effects down the road, right, with either ADEC or the EPA if they determine that it is backsliding from the federally approved moderate SIP.
That's correct. And in addition, in the context in which this ordinance is written, again, as it's written as an exemption to the curtailment program, the assumption is that these devices would be turned off, and so there would be zero emissions from the devices, and another alternative source of heat, such as an oil boiler, would be used. And so that's where the equivalency determination was made. And so there's the concern from an air quality perspective too, that if the devices, keeping in mind that this is laboratory testing is always best case scenario, real world is worse than that there could be real air quality implications and actually set us back further as well. But the threshold provides that safety net, and so it's backsliding, and then it's also, we're dealing with an air quality issue here, and we're trying to make the best decisions. And I would agree with your statement that it's very difficult to make these decisions and this number crunching on the fly. And as I stated earlier, we're not able to make any backsliding determinations or some of the more difficult, analysis on the fly.
Did you have anything to follow up, Mr. Mayor, and then Mr. Quist?
Yeah, so Ms. Koch testified that fiddling, I think her exact words are, fiddling with the number at all would cause her concern. Can't get a definitive answer. I think if we were fiddling to a small degree, I would be more comfortable, but an order of magnitude and making it tenfold in the wrong direction change would make me very nervous as far as just a can of worms and backsliding and whatnot. So I think this is a bit more of a jump than I'm comfortable with, but you guys get to make the decision. Thanks.
Lucky us. Mr. Quist and then Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. I'd request that the amendment does not carry the main motion.
Okay. Mr. Cooper?
I guess I was going to ask the mayor what his thoughts are on Mr. Lawrence's proposed amendment to the amendment.
That's what we're talking about.
Because I believe Mr. Mayor was referencing the order of magnitude that Mr. Roberts referenced. So what's your level of comfort with 0.01 versus 0.028?
It's about 50% better.
So I'd like to ask a technical question. And that is, I'm recalling that the uncertified test that we have run in North Pole, one of them was on a pellet stove. I don't know if it was EPA certified or not. And I'm trying to recall what the emission savings were. Weren't they about like 0.6 or 0.5 or something?
Yeah, I believe Ms. Olson testified that the emission reductions were approximately 60%. And we can just say 60% because we don't know where we started, and so we don't have a mass emission rate on that. Can't get it to a pound per million BTU number for comparison to that threshold.
And was that EPA certified? So according to this chart in front of us, that would be at 0.047. Is that about right?
I want to caution you against taking those numbers and applying them to the emission factors that you see in front of you, because emission factors and testing data are not the same
Okay,
data set.
Okay, thank you. On the amendment to the amendment, any other discussions? Nope. Clerk, it looks like we're ready to vote on the amendment to the amendment, and it certainly doesn't carry the main motion.
The main amendment.
And doesn't, yeah, thank you, the main amendment either. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
6-2.
It's adopted. The amendment is amended to read 0.01, and now that amended amendment is in front of us. Discussion on that. Seeing none, I think we're ready to vote. And of course, it just does not carry the main motion.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
5-3.
It's approved 5-3. Should have asked if anyone wants to change their vote after it was approved. So now I'm back to the main motion as amended, and I have Mr. Cooper and Mr. Quist.
All right. Well, didn't realize I was on the list next. So I guess just speaking to the main motion, taking a step back to some time ago when Mr. Roberts first introduced the ESP ordinance and this body did not adopt it. I mean, this is the process that we agreed on after that, and I'm very grateful that we've reached this point because, I think that we said to Mr. Roberts at the time, the way it's proposed now doesn't work, but let's figure out a way to make it work, and we went through that process to get to where we are today. And, a lot of credit to Mr. Roberts for bringing the idea forward in the first place, and Ms. Olson, and also a lot of credit to Mr. Zarnecki for all of his work and to his work with EPA and DEC on getting an ordinance together that, it's pretty amazing before we amended it to say everybody was here all on the same page. This is something that we worked with a state agency, a federal agency, local stakeholders, and borough staff to put together. And I recognize that in amending this, that's going to create some challenges now with a different number in it. And I think that my hope is that that there is some analysis of that number, assuming the ordinance as amended passes, and that if this number is not going to work, if there's backsliding concerns at DEC when it's looking at it, that we hear about that so that we can take the steps to address that down the road. But I think that given the situation that we're in, having some additional room in there at least to start that we can address if we need to is a good thing. And so that's why I ended up supporting that amendment. This is an opportunity for the borough to be a little bit bold in its action, which is not something we usually say about government being bold. And I know that there are folks who wish we'd be bolder in this field, but really this ordinance is a step in the right direction. I think it's something that we need to try, that we need to do, that we need to move forward. So I would just encourage all of my fellow assembly members to support this ordinance, to put this new code for ESPs on the books. We can talk about the funding separately. I probably have more to say on funding than I do on this, but I think this is an important thing that we really ought to do, and it's the right step at the right time. So.
Do you want to ask about pellet fuel appliances?
Oh, I guess there were. Mr. Fox had two questions about the pellet fuel appliances and whether that includes pellet-fed hydronic heaters, and also. Well, I guess we've made .0028 question moot at the moment, but so if you can answer about the pellet hydronic heaters, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And the intent is to just have that include pellet fuel stoves. Pellet-fueled hydronic heaters are specifically not included because we have data that the emission load is much too high for some of these aftermarket retrofit control devices to handle. And so perhaps that clarification should be made that it does not include pellet hydronic heaters, that it just includes pellet stoves in that category.
I guess I'll ask Ms. Dolan if there's an amendment that we need to make, or if the intent on the record is sufficient on that.
So we separately define hydronic heaters from pellet fuel appliances, so I think we're okay, but I'll check our other definitions real quick and then make sure.
Thanks.
Yep. And Mr. Quist, I had you on the main motion.
Yes, thank you. It was mentioned earlier that this is an opportunity to establish a new BACM best available control measure. The way I see this isn't a control measure. This is an exemption to a control measure. If we were to do something like require ESPs in order, for no ashes, or if it was a requirement, then that could be considered a control measure. But this is not. I just think that's an important distinction. That being said, even as amended, I would urge the adoption of this ordinance, and I'm very grateful to everybody who's worked on it, in particular Mr. Roberts for bringing this to our attention initially and continuing to work very hard on it. I see this as being an important part of the solution to this problem, so thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else on the motion as amended? Ms. Dolan, do you have a...
Yeah, as to Mr. Cooper's point, I think on line 162, after pellet fuel, we should insert the word stove before appliance.
Can I make that motion?
You certainly may.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Lawrence to add at the end of 162 the word stove. So it would read, a borough-listed appliance that is a pellet fuel stove appliance. Do you wish to speak anymore? Do we need to? Anybody opposed to that proposed amendment? Seeing none, it's approved. It's adopted. Yes, Mr. Mayor.
A question for Mr. Zarnecki. Back to what Mr. Fox had asked earlier. So the .0028 number, was that calculated off of regular home heating fuel or ULSD fuel?
It was calculated based on our current residential fuel mix, which is a weighted average between number 1 and number 2 fuel oil. Number 1 comprising 31.8% and number 2 comprising 68.2%.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Cooper.
I wanted to go back to one of the APCC recommendations about adding language that the ESP should be maintained, that the ordinance should be amended to include language requiring that the homeowner maintain and operate the ESPs per manufacturer's instructions. And I don't know if staff had a recommendation on that, if they felt that it was already covered under the requirements in, sorry, I have to flip back, lines 201 through 206, which outline the conditions of approval. Subsection C says a person receiving an RCD will perform any additional maintenance and monitoring determined necessary to maintain emission standards as established through field test. And would it be worth adding a requirement and pursuant to manufacturer instructions in there?
Yes, staff feels that it would be appropriate to add an amendment that says, and D, maintain and operate the appliance per manufacturer's instructions. And that's specifically because item C is speaking to the fact that we have or that we don't currently have a good handle on the long-term durability of these of retrofit control devices, and that's one of the main concerns, and that additional maintenance and monitoring as this program moves forward and as we get more test data can be laid out and figured out what's going to be required in order to make sure that these devices are functional in the long term. And so adding that as D staff would endorse that.
I would make that motion to amend accordingly.
Thank you. So moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Gray. But let me clarify if I might. So the language was maintain and operate per manufacturer requirements?
Per manufacturer's instructions.
So it appears to me that the appropriate amendment would be to, on 204, delete the word and between effectively and C, add a semicolon at the end of tests, add the word and, maintain and operate per manufacturer's instructions.
Correct.
Okay. Is there a discussion on that? Is there any objection to adding that to the amendment as presented? Seeing none, clerk, did you get that clear enough?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you. So that amendment is adopted. And let me see. Mr. Mayor, you were on my list, but I think you've already spoken. Anyone else on the, yes, Mr. Cooper.
Sorry, last comment. This is about no ash, and I won't go too far astray, except, Ms. Dolan, we can't, I don't think, amend this motion to address, or amend this ordinance to add no ash. Is that right?
Yeah, no, you'd have to do that through a separate ordinance.
Right. So I know that was a concern and question raised by several folks testifying. We heard more about no ash and ESPs during the work session last week, and I would expect that we might hear more about ESPs and no ashes coming forward. So thank you.
Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I would just point out that because some no ashes are done based on the level of income, and there's a certain cost to putting a no ash on a device, that any future ordinance that would seek to require these for no ashes had better have a source of funding and a way to actually help people put those on their stoves. Thanks.
Any other discussion, debate on the ordinance as amended? Seeing none, clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Mr. Tackey,
Yes.
Mr. Roberts,
Yes.
Mr. Cooper,
Yes.
Mr. Quist,
Yes.
Miss Major,
Yes.
Mr. Gray,
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence,
Yes.
Miss Dodge.
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
8-0.
it's adopted 8-0.